We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications. The Black Plague, the most devastating epidemic in human history. The Black Plague is one of the most devastating and deadly epidemics in human history. Wreaking havoc in Europe between 1347 and 1351, the plague killed 30 to 60% of Europe's population and left deep scars on the continent. The effects of the epidemic were not confined to Europe, but also spread to the Middle East and North Africa, killing millions of people. Origins of the Black Plague. The Black Plague originated in Central Asia. The disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis is spread by rodents and fleas. The westward migration of the Mongols and the use of trade routes brought the disease to Europe. Spread of the epidemic. The Black Plague began to spread rapidly after entering Europe from the Crimea. Trade ships, pilgrims, and soldiers played a major role in the spread of the disease. Europe's crowded cities and dirty water infrastructure created a favorable environment for the rapid spread of the plague. Symptoms of the Black Plague. Symptoms of the Black Plague include fever, headache, muscle aches, and swollen lymph nodes. As the disease progresses, blackening and necrosis of the skin can be seen. The plague can cause death within a few days of these symptoms. Effects of the Black Plague. The effects of the Black Death on Europe were devastating. The death of a large part of the population led to major disruptions in agriculture and trade. This caused social and economic turmoil in Europe. It also shook confidence in the church and religion and contributed to the changes that paved the way for the Renaissance. Combating the Black Plague. At the time, there was no known cure for the Black Plague. People tried to protect themselves from the disease through quarantine, prayer, and non-medical methods. The end of the epidemic is largely attributed to the vaccination of the population and the onset of cold weather. The aftermath of the Black Plague. The Black Plague had long-lasting effects in Europe. The loss of population and economic turmoil changed the political and social structure of Europe. It also led to advances in medicine and public health. Historical significance of the Black Plague. The Black Plague is one of the most significant events in human history. The devastating effects of the epidemic led to many changes in Europe. The Black Plague has taken its place in history as an example of the fragility of humanity and the danger of epidemics. More information about the Black Plague. The Black Plague has occurred more than once in Europe throughout history. The Great London Plague of 1665-1666 is one of the best-known outbreaks. The Black Plague still exists today. Plague epidemics occur from time to time in different parts of the world. Thanks to modern medicine and antibiotics, the Black Plague is no longer a deadly disease. The place of the Black Plague in art and literature. The Black Plague has been the subject of many works of literature and art. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron and Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat are among the most famous works about the plague. Detailed study of the impact of the Black Death. The impact of the Black Plague on Europe was not limited to population loss. The epidemic deeply affected every aspect of European society and led to lasting changes in many areas. Economic impact. The death of a large proportion of the population caused major disruption to agriculture and trade. The lack of people to work led to a decline in agricultural production and food shortages. The closure of trade routes and the quarantine of cities also brought commercial activity to a halt. Social impact. The Black Death also had a profound effect on the social structure of Europe. The breakdown of families and communities led to an increase in poverty and crime. It also changed the role of women and children in society. Religious impact. The Black Death shook confidence in the church and religion. In the face of the death and destruction caused by the plague, the church was criticized for not doing enough to help people. This situation paved the way for reform movements and contributed to the development of the Renaissance. Medical and scientific impact. The Black Death also led to developments in medicine and science. Studies were carried out to investigate the cause and spread of the epidemic, and these studies contributed to the development of modern medical science. Psychological effects. The Black Death created a widespread fear of death and pessimism in Europe. People lived in fear that they might die of the plague at any moment. This situation led to the beginning of a dark period in European art and literature. Aftermath of the Black Plague. The effects of the Black Plague continued for many years after the end of the epidemic. Population loss and economic turmoil changed the political and social structure of Europe. The epidemic also led to advances in medicine and public health. Effects of the Black Plague on different communities. The Black Plague did not affect all communities in Europe equally. Some groups were more affected than others. Jews. Many Jews were subjected to pogroms during the Black Plague. The public had a false belief that Jews were responsible for the plague. This caused many Jews to die and emigrate from Europe. Peasants. The Black Plague affected peasants more than any other group. Most peasants fled the cities and sought refuge in the countryside to avoid the plague. This led to a decline in agricultural production and food shortages. Clergy. The Black Plague also deeply affected the clergy. Many priests and pastors died from the plague. This shook confidence in the church and religion. Women. The Black Plague also changed the role of women in society. After many men died from the plague, women had to take on the role of the head of the family. This contributed to women gaining more power in society. Effects of the Black Plague on today. The effects of the Black Plague are still felt today. The epidemic led to the development of modern medical science and advances in public health in Europe. In addition, the population loss and economic turmoil caused by the Black Plague permanently changed the political and social structure of Europe. Effects of the Black Death in different regions. Europe. The Black Death affected Europe the most. A large part of the population died from the plague, leading to lasting changes in the political, social, and economic structure of Europe. Middle East. The Black Death also affected the Middle East. It caused great loss of life, particularly in Egypt and Syria. It also contributed to the weakening of the Mamluk Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire. North Africa. The Black Plague also affected North Africa. It caused great loss of life, particularly in Morocco and Tunisia. The epidemic also contributed to the Berber revolt in the region and their independence. Asia. The Black Death also affected some parts of Asia. It caused great loss of life, particularly in India and China. It also contributed to the weakening of the Mongol Empire and the rise of the Timurid Empire. Historical significance of the Black Death. The Black Plague is one of the most significant events in human history. Its devastating effects triggered many changes in Europe. The Black Plague has taken its place in history as an example of the fragility of humanity and the danger of epidemics. The place of the Black Plague in art and literature. The Black Plague has been the subject of many works of art and literature. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron and Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat are among the most famous works about the plague. More information about the Black Death. The Black Plague has occurred more than once in Europe throughout history. The Great London Plague of 1665-1666 is one of the best-known outbreaks. The Black Plague still exists today. Plague epidemics occur from time to time in different parts of the world. Thanks to modern medicine and antibiotics, the Black Plague is no longer a deadly disease. Methods of combating the Black Plague. At the time, there was no known cure for the Black Plague. However, people used various methods to prevent the spread of the disease and to protect themselves. Quarantine. Some cities began to quarantine themselves to prevent the spread of the plague. Cities were closed to entry and exit, and people at risk from the epidemic were quarantined. However, it is clear that these practices are generally inadequate and cannot completely stop the spread of the epidemic. Prayer and religious ceremonies. During the pandemic, people turned to prayer and religious ceremonies to appease God's anger. Church authorities also organized various religious ceremonies during the epidemic. However, it is clear that these practices were not effective in preventing the plague. Separation and isolation. To protect themselves from the epidemic, some people fled the cities and sought refuge in the countryside. People who showed signs of the plague were also excluded from society. These measures may have reduced the spread of the disease to some extent. Essential oils and herbs. People of the time used some essential oils and herbs to protect themselves from the plague. However, these practices had no scientific basis, and there is no evidence that they were effective in controlling the epidemic. Plague doctors. During the Black Plague, people wearing masks and long clothes called plague doctors appeared. These people were not responsible for treating the sick. Instead, they were involved in tasks such as collecting and burning the bodies of plague victims. Causes of the end of the Black Death. The Black Plague began to lose its effect in Europe around 1351. It is thought that there were several reasons for this. Population loss. The death of a large proportion of the population from the plague may have made it harder for the disease to spread. The decrease in the number of healthy people may have broken the chain of the bacteria's spread and led to the natural end of the epidemic. Acquisition of immunity. People who survived the outbreak developed immunity to the disease over time. This may have slowed the spread of the epidemic and made it less effective over time. Cold weather. Cold weather may have limited the spread of the plague bacteria. The end of the Black Plague coincides with the beginning of the cold season in Europe. Long-term effects of the Black Plague. The effects of the Black Plague continued for many years after the end of the epidemic. Economic and social change. Population decline and labor shortages led to a major recession in the European economy. The agricultural and commercial sectors were severely affected. This led to an increase in serf wages and a weakening of the feudal system. Social transformation. The pandemic also led to significant changes in the structure of European society. The role of women in society increased. The number of families decreased. There was an atmosphere of fear and anxiety in society. Religious beliefs. The Black Death shook the belief in church and religion. The inability to prevent the epidemic and the growing desperation of the people led to increased criticism of the church. Developments in medicine and science. The Black Death contributed to the development of knowledge about anatomy in the human body. It also led to scientific studies of the spread of epidemics. Conclusion. The Black Death is regarded as one of the most devastating and deadly epidemics in human history. This epidemic, which ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, left deep scars, killing 30 to 60% of the continent's population. The effects of the epidemic were not confined to Europe, but also spread to the Middle East and North Africa, killing millions of people. The effects of the Black Death were not limited to population loss, but deeply affected every aspect of European society. It led to economic stagnation, social upheaval, shaken religious beliefs, and advances in medicine. The end of the epidemic has been attributed to a number of factors, including vaccination, cold weather, and quarantine. The story of the Black Plague has gone down in history as an example of the fragility of humanity and the danger of epidemics. It radically changed the political, social, economic, and cultural structure of Europe, and its long-term effects are still felt today. The lessons to be learnt from the Black Plague are as follows. Be prepared for epidemics. Epidemics are always a threat. It is therefore important to be prepared for such threats at national and international level. Respond quickly and effectively. When epidemics occur, it is important to respond quickly and effectively. This will help control the spread of the disease and minimize loss of life. Scientific research and development. Scientific research and development is very important in the fight against epidemics. The development of new treatments and vaccines is one of the most important weapons in the fight against epidemics. International cooperation. Epidemics know no borders. International cooperation against such threats is therefore extremely important. Sharing information and resources between countries increases the effectiveness of the fight against epidemics. The devastating impact of the Black Plague should not be forgotten. The lessons we learn from this pandemic will enable us to better protect ourselves against future epidemics. We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.